Hey guys, and welcome to Power and Market, our podcast dedicated to looking at the week in review, checking out articles published at Mises.org and everything in the headlines. Thankfully, it has been a non-eventful week this week here, so we'll figure out something to discuss with our roundtable panel today. We've got, of course, Ryan McMaken, executive editor of Mises.org, and Mr. Connor O'Keefe, who's got our weekly Wednesday morning column and does all sorts of different things here at the Mises Institute, our TikTok and Instagram star as well. So guys, again, what can we talk about today? An uneventful week here in this great country. How about last night? We have a massive coordinated attack from Israel towards Iran. We have Iran responding with the waving of the red revenge flag as we speak right now. As we are recording this, we've got the reports of ballistic missiles firing. We've got domestic fallout in terms of what is Trump going to do, the leading up with him taking a public stand in favor of diplomacy, obviously Israel having different ideas. And so there's a lot to unravel from this, and I guess we will begin with you, Ryan. What was your reaction to getting X notifications flying off the wall that indeed something has in fact happened here in the Middle East?
Well, I guess I would just say so much for America first, right? The idea that Trump was going to focus on things that were directly related to items of national interest to the United States, to the actual territorial integrity of the United States, those issues that are extremely important to the United States, and instead has decided to go all in, 80% in, with the state of Israel and make a bunch of statements about good for them, great, excellent bombing campaign. And of course, the only way that this was even possible is because the United States continues to funnel hundreds of billions of dollars to the state of Israel. So this, of course, has nothing to do with the defense of the United States. It's amazing how gullible Trump supporters and other pro-war people are on this. Of course, not all of Trump supporters are pro-war, as we'll kind of get into later, I think. This is probably fraction. This is probably going to cause factions in the Trump base. But those who are, they're just repeating all the same stuff we heard during Iraq. Right? Weapons of mass destruction. It's a clear and present danger to the United States. Better fighting them over there than fighting over here, et cetera, et cetera. It's even if Iran say, and we can talk about some of the details of that, but let's say that even if Iran is close to getting nuclear fissile material, which from what I've seen, there's a big leap yet from the sort of material you need for, say, nuclear energy and very low-grade nuclear weapons, and then the sort of stuff that's actually an international threat. But even if they were moving toward that, how would this be fundamentally different from the state of Pakistan having nuclear weapons as far as the United States is concerned? Yeah, clearly, Iran's closer to the state of Israel. Clearly, Iran is a threat to, or potentially a threat, perhaps a threat in the eyes of some rivals of Iran, in not just state of Israel, but also maybe Saudi Arabia. But it's always the same thing when we're talking about nuclear arms. We heard the same thing about North Korea, right? Oh, if North Korea gets the bomb, it's going to be the end of the world. America better intervene because it's just going to be one horrific nightmare. And then North Korea gets the bomb. We never hear anything about it again. U.S. does some low-level attempts at negotiation and stuff. Nobody's ever talking about it. It was the same with Pakistan, right? Back in the 70s and 80s. Oh, we can't let Pakistan get the bomb. If you let any Muslims get the bomb, it's going to be crazy. They're going to immediately start bombing everybody else in the vicinity. And then they get the bomb in 1998. We never hear about it hardly ever again. And for example, I mean, they even are kind of unself-aware about the issue. I was looking at an article today that came out just a few weeks ago from a guy named Michael Rubin at AEI, and it's titled "America Failed to Stop Pakistani Nukes. Will it repeat the error with Iran?" And then he goes in and talks about the problem with Pakistani nukes, and none of it has anything to do with the United States. and it's defense. It's just a bunch of stuff that's tangentially related to maybe some distant interests of the U.S., but the Pakistani bomb has nothing to do with the United States. And in Iran, and Pakistan, by the way, has missiles. They've got a missile program, which the U.S. sometimes talks about. But the Pakistani bomb, not a threat to the U.S. The same would be true of the Iran bomb. But we hear about it all the time because the state of Israel doesn't like it. But, I know this will be a shock to a lot of people. The state of Israel is in the United States. And the state of Israel offers nothing to the United States in terms of safety, in terms of protecting U.S. interests. It's actually a huge net liability to the interests of America. So that's why many of the America First people wanted to get away from that. But the Trump administration now appears to be doubling down on that, talking about how great their missile attack is. The U.S. is going to keep supporting this, bragging there are elements in Washington bragging about how, oh, yes, the U.S. is going to give Iran great intelligence on this. So the U.S. is totally involved and looks like it's going to continue to get involved, and it just has nothing to do with America First. So that just seems to be now out the window. So it'll be interesting to see going forward how Trump's base reacts to this.
Before we get to you, Connor, Ron, I do want to just throw it out there because some of the narrative that you get out there is kind of that they treat Iran as sort of a unique case in terms of international relations, that this is an irrational state actor motivated by like religious fundamentalism, that, the entire statecraft is surrounded by kind of Mahadism and the desire to see. And so can you just want to address that point? Because it seems like, I think the Pakistan point is particularly interesting relative to others here. But can you just address that at all? Because I know that is part of the conversation in the ether here on why Iran is a particularly unique case with this broader conversation about nuclear proliferation.
Well, of course, they used to say the exact same thing about the Soviet Union. The fundamental argument here is that nuclear deterrence doesn't work because state X is run by crazy people. That's what they always say. They say it about North Korea. They said it about the Soviet Union. They say it about every state that looks like it might get the bomb or has the bomb, unless it's a U.S. ally, right? Unless it's a NATO ally. The French, of course, are eminently sane. The British are eminently sane. Anyone else who has the bomb that the U.S. approves of is fine. But the Soviets, and then, of course, hilariously, this was the argument for de-arming the Ukraine after the end of the Cold War, when Ukraine had its own bomb. Well, what if crazy people get to be in charge of Ukraine? Ukraine's going to sell all of its bombs to terrorists and to shady third actors. They can't be trusted. They're going to do all that. There are zero examples of that sort of proliferation actually happening. What it turns out is that every time a state gets the bomb, is they turn out to behave like every other state that has the bomb in terms of international nuclear deterrence. And North Korea's no different. In fact, if anything, these countries become way, way more conservative in terms of their geopolitical behavior because they now are assured of the continuation of their regime, because that's really the only thing that bombs are good for. Is they're not good for expanding, they're not good for imperial growth, they're not good for invading other countries, and tons of research behind this. This isn't just stuff I'm making up, right? This is tons of stuff from international journals, from historical analysis, because we can't show any cases where the bomb was used as a means of expanding rule to neighboring countries. Look at how the war in Ukraine, of course, is conventional. The state of Israel, by the way, we need to make crystal clear, is a nuclear-armed country. By the way, they haven't signed off on international nuclear treaties. They refuse to do so in spite of international pressure, because they don't want to be held by any rules that other countries are in terms of nuclear proliferation. They're against proliferation for everyone but themselves, of course. The same is true of the United States. So when they say that Iran is crazy, that it's different this time, they've said that about every other country that was looking to get the bomb. And I still see people out there who are clueless saying something about how if Iran gets the bomb, it'll be the first country with Muslims that have control of the bomb. They don't even know about Pakistan. And of course, we all regard these crazy Muslims, right, as they're far more crazy than the people in North Korea, right, who have like one of the worst, most horrific totalitarian states in the world. And we could also, their whole Juche ideology is like over the top racist in terms of the Korean race is superior to all other races and stuff like this. If you read up on the North Korean ideology, that's a key component of it. So wouldn't they be willing then to use the bomb against other countries? Well, so far, it seems that they have no interest whatsoever. Again, the bomb is being used here as a means of preserving the regime. And it's a means of preserving the regime in the sense that every time you look at the United States invading countries and talking about invading countries, it's always a country without the bomb. And then once they get the bomb, America just immediately stops talking about regime change and invading that country. So you can see what the motivation is. And here we go again, just being told the exact same stuff about how these people are crazy. So it just happens again and again. And they said the same thing about the Soviets, said the same thing during the Cold War over and over again, because, of course, you talk about these crazy conservatives who back then were saying things like, I would be happy to destroy the Soviet Union, and if it costs and if it requires a pile of 10 million or 40 million American corpses, that's fine with me. This is what people at the National Review were saying. So yes, the very sane Americans who wanted piles of millions of American corpses to stop the Soviet ideology, these are the people now talking about how everyone else is too crazy to have the bomb. So that just seems pretty typical, and there's nothing new there.
So how about you, Connor? What was your reaction? Again, giving doom scrolling a whole new meaning last night. What was your immediate response?
It's sort of in the same vein. I think, obviously the nuclear question is kind of central to all this, but this doesn't happen last night if Iran had a nuclear bomb. It's sort of, I think you're correct to characterize this as about control a lot more than defense. There's just taking an honest look at the history here. And, this has been something that a lot of people, especially in our circles, have been talking about for a long time, that Hawks, but, especially Netanyahu and kind of his Israeli faction have been talking about how Iran is very close to a nuclear weapon for decades now. And for a while, it was like they were a couple of years away. But for the last, as long as I've been paying attention to it, they've been weeks away. And there's kind of two possibilities with that. Either they're lying about it and it's not true, and they're just kind of trying to use it as a propaganda point, or it is true, in which case the Iranians are not deciding to actually develop a nuke. They're holding on to that kind of status quo. And, you can point to things in the past, like the Supreme Leader had that fatwa against, like, the official position of the Iranian regime is that they do not believe it's that having a nuke is something that they should do. Of course, my reaction to what happened last night is I think that this has just destroyed the credibility of anybody in Iran who is saying, hey, we can work with the West here. There are elements in the West that we can trust. Obviously, as I said at the beginning, this would not have happened to them if they had a nuke. And I think, especially looking at this from an American perspective, zooming out, Trump sort of represented, and we were talking about this a few weeks ago. What we were hoping was sort of this new direction where, coming in on related to the Middle East, we were talking all about as negotiations in the Middle East, but also with Russia over Ukraine, that he was able to come in and basically say, hey, I know, to the Russians, the American establishment has betrayed, your trust when it comes to earlier agreements relating to NATO expansion and stuff like that. And similarly in the Middle East, that he could kind of come in and be this new, symbolize a new direction. And just the fact that whether the Israelis deceived Trump as well and kind of told him, hey, yeah, keep negotiating here. We're not going to attack, behind the scenes, or as they're, both officially claiming now that they both knew that this was going to happen. Trump was publicly saying, we have the next stage of negotiations kicking off on Sunday, gives all public, in the public is acting like he is telling the Israelis to not do this, to not escalate to, the violent stage we're in now. And then turns around after the Israelis do just that and say, yeah, we knew all along. I just don't see how that doesn't completely destroy Trump's credibility, certainly when it comes to negotiating with the Iranians to the extent that that's even possible going forward. I know Israel killed a number of the negotiators last night, but also with like Russia. Russia already had so little reason to ever trust what the Americans agree to going forward. And, there was maybe potential that Trump could be like a new direction, but I just don't see how that's just been torpedoed going forward.
Well, I think the timeline of all of this is interesting because obviously there was big changes this week where it seems sort of the tenor, the warning lights were coming on earlier this week. Obviously, ever since October 7th, there's been escalation between Israel and Iran and next proxies. Hezbollah has been Israel's done a lot of work there. You've had prior back and forth exchange of weaponry there. The lack of air defense systems last night in Iran. Part of that is as a result of previous Israeli strikes from a few months ago. And the diplomacy aspect of it, I do think is interesting because there has been this building narrative, and we're going to talk about immigration here in a bit, right? But there has been this kind of this interesting narrative that has been building with Trump over the last several months, right? So that the taco narrative, right? That Trump always chickens out, and there's a domestic element to it. Now we can have a separate conversation on like if you are part of the faction that thinks Trump is crazy, and then you're kind of poking him for being a chicken, like what do you expect that to kind of what do you expect the consequences of that? That's a different sort of conversation there. But within here, like there was clear that there was serious diplomacy going on within the Middle East. You had decisions being made by the Trump administration either against the stated desires, at least, of Netanyahu and Israel. You had direct diplomacy with Hamas at times that the Israelis were not particularly enthused about. You had the recognition of Syria and some of what Steve Witkoff has been doing in the Middle East and the like. And then the tenor this week definitely changed. You had Trump publicly saying, hey, look, give us this weekend. We're still working it out. This is, I guess, aligned with like a 60-day threat that Trump made with Iran 2 months ago and the like. But again, it's publicly having this face. And so it really goes down to what were the inner dynamics here. And we've seen the Israeli reports, right, that, this was all cover. This was all a big facade. Maybe that's true. On the other side is it's very, maybe it's possible that Trump was made aware of Israel's intentions here, could not stop them, perhaps was not willing to take additional steps to assert dominance within that relationship there. And so this whole dynamic, how does this relationship go going forward? The early statements out there were, awe of the attack, praising of a statement of support for Israel. How this ends up going forward is I think going to be very interesting. We're still kind of in a fog of war dynamic here. And the other side of it, though, and there's a lot more to unpack in terms of both the domestic politics of it, this broader talk about the fallout with the Trump coalition, which I think is very interesting here. But the other side of it is the lack of response from Iran, I think, is very interesting. I mean, Ryan, you talked about kind of the security of the regime, the stability of the Iranian regime, the way, obviously a nuclear weapon is a major part of it. But you now going to have a regime in Iran that looks extremely weak based off of this and the lack of real response to the previous attacks here. A weak regime can be a very dangerous regime, or it could be a demonstration of a toothless regime. And of course, that's going to have ramifications in terms how Russia reacts, how China reacts, how Pakistan reacts. We had Houthi attacks, missile launches going on today towards Israel. But the weakness of Iran here creates secondary effects that it's going to be interesting to see the fallout from that as well, short of something that's a real demonstration of strength here in the next coming days.
Well, and of course, the fact is we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's always, I mean, you do podcasts like this about a topic that's in motion, and then everything's outdated 36 hours later in terms of your data. So, I mean, by the time the weekend is over, I have no idea what's going to happen. Is it going to be part of a longer conflict? And it could be that this is just this is just a matter of, hey, we just need to bomb them for the Israelis are saying we need to bomb Iran just to remind them who's the boss around here. And also for domestic political reasons, right? People need to keep in mind there's always domestic political reasons that are very important in these cases, right? Shoring up your base, making sure that certain interest groups within your coalition are happy, that sort of thing. And that's true on both sides. And it's not just people playing international chess and thinking when the state is already this totally solid unit where everybody's in agreement. No, there are factions within each state and they're behaving in a way that they think is going to help, that the ruling party thinks is going to help shore up support. So I don't know what behavior that's going to lead to in both of these cases. You have to then drill down and look at a separate unit of analysis. So we'll know more in a week or two, but at the moment, it's for looking at it from the American perspective, it's clear that this administration is not, in fact, committed to this idea of America first and staying out of foreign conflicts. And so if anything, it's allowing itself to get more and more involved. And I think that's going to spell a lot of trouble for the United States moving forward in a variety of ways.
Well, and Connor, you touched on a little bit about kind of the domestic ramifications. I mean, we've seen Tucker Carlson out there with statements saying that, let Israel do what Israel may, but America should stay out of it. A lot of people that are kind of connected to broader Vance world were kind of making similar statements. Charlie Kirk had a similar statement there. And so if we're just kind of looking at the kind of the public faces of what is perceived as, MAGA Inc., if you will, it wasn't necessarily massive cheerleading for this the same way that, if you look at like Mark Levin's Twitter feed or some traditional, earlier Fox News sort of punditry out there and the like. So how do you see kind of the domestic MAGA coalition sort of responding to this? Because I given other challenges that are up there, and of course there's going to be economic fallout here, gas prices, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of, again, there's so many layers to a global political event like this. Yeah, how do you expect kind of the domestic coalition to respond?
Yeah, well, similarly, I don't like predicting too much because there's so many factors that are moving now that will determine that. And I think a lot of that comes down to if they do, how Iran responds. I think a lot of people are justifiably worried about all of the American troops in the region. And I think if the Iranians were to target them directly and start sending ballistic missiles, I think you have a lot more potential for, once American soldiers are being killed, for especially the right to rally around Trump. Whereas I think if Iran were to go a different direction, I saw some people talking about how they could just try to essentially wage economic war and close the Straits of Hormuz and stop exporting any oil. And if they did that, they were not targeting American troops directly, then you essentially have the right, which is, to your point, already more fractured on this than I expected. Plus, if oil prices double for a series of months as a result of this, and there's not this like pure kind of like, this imagery of Americans and American equipment getting destroyed that they can kind of use to galvanize support. I don't see how how this doesn't become less of a problem for Trump. I think it would just get worse and worse. So there's a lot of factors, and it is still a big question mark as to how this plays out. I think it was kind of clear from the way, based on what we know now, that this was not what Israel did last night was not a pure anti-nuclear infrastructure strike. This was a decapitation attempt, and it looks like they're trying to move towards regime change. And it's like, to what I said earlier, I think that one aspect of what we're talking about with Iran having been toothless so far is about who's in power over there. And I do think you have factions that are a lot more hardline, and they have not been at the helm of things. And I think this has the potential to change that. So if they, come to power, I could see Iran scrambling and trying to develop a nuclear weapon as soon as they're able to, which then forces the Israelis to kind of keep this up, to keep destroying any kind of progress they could make. They sort of essentially have to hold the boulder up so it doesn't crush them. And, then it kind of becomes a question of, is actual regime change a possibility? It doesn't seem that clear to me, like who could come in and take power. I mean, there's the Shah, who has a lot of support amongst people that fled Iran when the Shah lost power, but it doesn't seem like he's going to be greeted as a liberator going back in, or like MEK or a bunch of crazy Marxists that like they'll use as like useful propaganda tools to kind of demonize the people or the regime in Iran. But there's like not this obvious, group that could be installed that would actually kind of lead to a relatively stable situation there. This seems like something that, Israel bit off that they're going to have to work at for a long period of time. And depending on how that goes, I could see right-wing support for it within the United States swinging one way or the other. It's just kind of a matter how this plays out.
Well, of course, speaking of regime change, Netanyahu survived an attempt to change parliament over the weekend, right before this attack. This coalition became out a little bit weaker, but that gave him kind of a stall. And I think they got 6 months before any similar attempt can happen again. So interesting that timing as well as the backdrop there for everything else that might proceed from here. Moving on from that, though, another thing that kind of tested kind of Trump's coalition, if you will, has been the topic of immigration. Obviously, we've seen rioting in LA and this growing, expectable, predictable battleground between Gavin Newsom and Donald Trump, resulting from riots and violence breaking out, as a result of ICE raids and the like. You had Trump seemingly conceding to kind of the immigration hardliners within his coalition, talking about conditions needing to be made or accommodations being made for illegal workers, separating them a bit from the criminal element of that. Ryan, you had an article on The Wire this week talking about how Trump will be unable to deport 18 million illegal aliens, the number in your title here. So Ryan, you want to kick us off on this broader topic of immigration, the other major newsworthy item this week?
Well, for my article this week, I just wanted to at least just take a pretty kind of dispassionate look at, what is Trump's stated goal, and is there any chance of him actually carrying it out, regardless of whether you're in favor of it or not? And you look at the numbers, and what I found was that it's just going to get harder and harder to find people to deport, was kind of the basic premise here. So you look at these huge deportation. Well, let's just look at the larger historical numbers. So I provide some graphs in the article, and you can see that you started to see a real clampdown on immigration in the 80s and 90s. And this was in response to a real change in Latin American immigration, where you just started to get a lot more of it into the United States in the 70s. And then so in the 80s, they start really cracking down on it, as portrayed hilariously in the movie Born in East LA, by the way. If you've never seen, I highly recommend that film, starring Cheech. But not Chong. It's a solo job from Cheech. So it's like a 1985 movie, I think. It's a comedy. But this was back when people were more chill, I guess, because the premise is that he gets swept up in a immigration raid and gets shipped to Mexico, even though he's an American-born citizen. And then he has to get back to America, and comedy ensues. But this was in the 80s in response to new increases in the numbers of immigration raids that were taking place. And if you look at the numbers then, by the 90s, under Clinton, you started to get huge numbers, like 5-6 million deportations a year sort of thing. Under George W. Bush, as if you remember those days, for those of us who remember, Bush kind of ignored the border, and you started to see a big decline in the number of deportations in that period, which was always funny and ironic in a dark way, because Bush was constantly going on and on about how there's this axis of evil and America has all these enemies everywhere, and basically opened up the southern border as well. It wasn't keeping an eye on that at all. So he was shipping all American troops to the other side of the planet, but the southern border wasn't vetting the people who were coming in. Lots of people complained about that at the time, and you do see that in the numbers. Actual deportations went down a lot. during George W. Bush's time, and then they declined a lot more, even Obama. But even if Trump were to really ratchet up the number of deportations he's like going to barely be able to match Obama's numbers. And those numbers were way down from the peak numbers that you saw under Clinton and early George W. Bush. Now, you saw a big increase then under Biden, but that was because there were so many people crossing the border into the United States that rounding up a couple million deportees was basically effortless because they were just everywhere. And so, but that was still a small percentage of net overall in-migration. Well, Trump now has basically closed the border. It could be that we're actually looking at negative net in-migration at the moment. So Trump's accomplishing that as he promised. But once you basically have your flow of people in and around the border area kind of dry up, well, now suddenly you got to look for other places for deportees. And I think what Trump got elected on were all these promises to deport the crazies, right? People eating your neighborhood dog, right? Remember, right? They're eating the cats and dogs thing. I don't know how true that was. I'm sure it happened like once at least. I don't know how common it was, but the point is it created this example of something that was going on. And clearly everybody wanted that out of their community. Only like crazy hard left people thought this is fine. And so you had that. Then, of course, you had the real criminals, right? You had all of these headline cases of like teenage girls and stuff being brutally raped and murdered and stuff. Everybody wanted those people gone, except crazy leftist ideologues. And Trump ran a lot on that, or at least his I don't know that he personally mentioned that a lot, but certainly his followers were out there pushing that all the time. So it seems like there's been a lot of focus on that, getting rid of the criminals and the crazies. Well, once you get all rid of those, who's left? Well, then you got people who've been in the United States for 10 years, people with established economic ties to the local community, people with established cultural ties to the local community who live in neighborhoods and so on. These aren't people like living in luxury hotels in New York City, like the recent arrivals that everybody wanted gone because they were also living on the public dole. So what happens when the only immigrants you got left are people who have been here a while, who have jobs, who are tied in with a local church community, tied in with a local employer? Well, then you start to get people who are thinking, well, maybe we don't need to get rid of those people so much. Now, certainly there is a subgroup of Trump and MAGA people who want they don't want just illegal immigrants gone. They want like coming up with ways to get rid of legal immigrants too. And so people are pushing that too within MAGA, but I suspect that there's not nearly as much public support for that or even as much public bandwidth for that, right? People are like, as long as they see that criminals are getting deported and stuff, they're like, okay, I guess things are moving in the right direction, and they stop thinking about it. And so what was very interesting is that even after all of these, I don't know, it seems like weeks, but I guess maybe it's only been a week of riots in LA and all of that, is Trump comes back and he gives a speech yesterday saying, well, you know, we've been really aggressive with our deportation, but it turns out that there are a lot of farmers in America and like hotel owners, and he didn't mention them, but probably you could just point to lots of private sector employers in general, right? Or people who are dealing with subcontractors who, are they legal residents? Who knows? Does anyone care who's dealing with them as on an economic level? Almost nobody. And so Trump comes in and he says, well, maybe we should stop deporting these farm workers and these hotel workers because there's lots of great people out there that are employing those people. So we're gonna change things, and we're not gonna target those people as much. Now, of course, the diehard MAGA people were just absolutely freaking out about that, called that a betrayal. But I think maybe it's a realization on Trump's part that a lot of his base of support, which is small business people or mid-level farmers and stuff, that these people, yeah, of course they want the criminal elements gone. And of course they want the welfare queen immigrants gone. But these people also have established economic relationships and in some cases social relationships with immigrants who have been in the country a long time. And nobody's bothering to check up if they're legal or illegal, because remember, fundamentally, the difference between a legal and an illegal immigrant is paperwork, right? Have they done their paperwork? Now, a lot of people will tell you, well, they're criminals because they're here illegally. Yeah, because they don't have the right paperwork. Now, when you phrase it that way, they kind of like pretend that that's not the reality, but it is. And also, if you look back at the reality of 100 years ago, right, there wasn't really paperwork to deal with. And they'll say, well, there's a welfare state now. Yes. And that's why I've said for years, right? If someone comes to the border and they sign a piece of paper and they agree and they get an ID and it says forever not eligible for welfare, forever not eligible for citizenship, that's something else entirely. And that's, I think, the distinctions that people are starting to make is that, yeah, there's like the peaceful immigrants, then there's the crazies who are out protesting or killing people, raping people, eating your dog, and we all want those gone. The problem is can he find enough people in these communities and in these workplaces to deport without any significant pushback? And so if you just keep raiding private sector job sites and getting rid of those people, that's going to have a much different political outcome and political reading than is, yeah, we found the jails, we found all these horrible violent criminals in the jails, and we're deporting them, which virtually everyone would cheer. So it's just a different situation. And best case scenario by the Trump's own estimates is that they're shooting for 1 million deportations a year. So that's going to be maximum 4 million deportations a year. And that's going to put him under pretty much all presidents for the last 30, heck, even 40 years. So it's just not going to be a big number. Meanwhile, we've got groups, pro-Trump groups, telling us that there are 18 million illegal aliens in the United States. So, I mean, if there's not going to be the big fundamental change in terms of the number of immigrants that are in the United States. But I do think that a lot of Trump voters are going to be happy just knowing that the criminals are on the run and that they're being deported and that also that the border's basically closed. I think a lot of people are just going to be happy with that. But when you come to them and say, yeah, we're going to round up all these employees and all these people at your church and we're going to deport them, I think people are going to be less happy about that. And then you're going to get more pushback again. So it's going to be real hard to expand from 2 million after a couple of years, assuming you still keep the border closed, up to that 4 million target, because you're targeting more and more people who are perceived to be not as much of a threat, at least to normal non-diehard MAGA people. So that's basically the phenomenon I was looking at, and the idea is just that things are going to get harder and harder for Trump in terms of ongoing deportations, assuming the border stays closed, and it'll just be interesting to see how that works out over time.
Of course, a lot of that pushback has been political. Again, we've got Democrat resistance, we have judicial resistance. Connor, I know you talked a little bit. You've written in the past about the judicial, some of the judicial resistance that Trump has faced, and perhaps some of the cynical motives that underpin some of that. In any direction that you want to take this broader topic of immigration in the news?
No, I haven't been researching it quite as deeply as Ryan, but I think you're right to bring optics kind of right to the center of your analysis here. I think it's notable that by far Trump's biggest win on immigration so far has been the flow over the border. But as you know, libertarians and free market economists are often saying, thanks especially that Bastiat and then Henry Hazlitt's book about it, that's an unseen win. There's not, you don't get visible or optics of people that just decide not to show up at the border, not even try, even though it's striking the change between Biden and Trump. And so the administration, they want to get the numbers up, the deportation numbers up, which has kind of prompted this specific effort, from what I understand it, that they're sort of expanded and going after, showing up at Home Depots and going after day laborers to try to crank those numbers up. Because, there's a fair amount of people in their base that want the numbers to be high. And then that, leads to them running into the issue on the other side, which is that I think there's sort of an analogy to the topic that we've discussed a few times here with government spending, where, with government spending, a lot on the right like it in theory, but then when you actually get specific with like specific programs, they tend not to be on board with it, if it's going after their Social Security. I think there's a similar dynamic here, where a lot of Trump's base are very happy to like enthusiastically cheer on mass deportations, But once that kind of gets to the point where it's, the people that they kind of like in their community, or, these families of poor farm workers that are, on camera being tugged out in handcuffs, you start losing people, and you start losing pretty fast. I think, ironically, the left has really helped sort of push that problem down the road with these riots. I think that there were few better optics the administration could hope for than cars burning and people, waving these Mexican flags. That was great for that's for the president's side in this optics battle. But that the statement he gave that you referenced about amnesty does hint that they're sensitive to not trying to go too far with it too. But I think that it really it comes back to the fact that politics is just kind of about optics at the end of the day. And you can point out that border crossings have maybe even gone negative, like you said, but that's not going to give that kind of visible, punchy kind of optics that the administration really wants, and that a lot of their voters voted for with this. So that's the factor that is going to drive this going forward.
Yeah, I definitely think one of Trump's assets so far has been the quality of its domestic opposition, right? Like, I mean, Democrats, I think, just seem to be like stepping on rake mode, and just kind of picking kind of the worst optics possible of making anti-Trump points. We'll see how this weekend's No Kings rallies go. I'm sure nothing bad will happen that will certainly feed in the hands of the administration on that front. But I think this taps into similar to the domestic aspect of the concerns about foreign policy last time is the Trump coalition, right? The whole 2024 Trump brand was this broader coalition building, and kind of similar to what we touched on last week with the Elon tension over spending, which seems to be resolved. They're now bros again for the most part, it seems, at least publicly, right? But I think there's a lot of kind of misunderstanding within a lot of the online New Right, MAGA base, whatever, on like what the realities of this coalition really look like. And what's, you have a lot of people that focus kind of in this, they have this sort of almost conservative, quasi-Marxist sort of worldview of like laborers, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, but in this case it'd be like this concept of like the American laborer versus the elite. And what is left out of that conversation is the small business owner, right? And that is a major part of the Trump coalition that has, and often is one of the points of the opposition against anything the regime, whatever regime of the day is, right? It was the core of the anti-FDR delegation, all this sort of stuff. And like the small business calculation when it comes to immigration is a totally different sort of conversation within this, particularly when we start touching on like legal immigration restrictionism, right? And so we can talk about these broader aspects of culture and assimilation and all these things I think are valid. And there's been an absence of that conversation within broader American politics, which has definitely fueled, I think, the hardline perspective in ways that were marginalized, 20, 30 years ago. But I just see, particularly this week, and also helps the timing, I've been reading a biography of Grover Cleveland and his second administration, right? Like Grover Cleveland, the first time around was very, he prided himself on kind of being beyond politics. He had a very kind of restrained view of the president. He didn't play games with kind of putting loyalists into positions in order to get political capital and like. And then he came in the second time around, and he kind of came prepared to kind of be more political for effectiveness of his agenda. And then immediately he is one hit with a coalition split over tariffs on a bit. They have a very thin majority, which leads to a watered down bill dealing with tariffs, which is kind of similar to the spending aspect here. Dealing with the consequences of the McKinley tariff, ironically enough in this conversation, and the consequences of like free silver and the like, which creates economic crises, which something like, decreased interest in American Treasury bonds might create, right? You have union riots that break out, particularly in like Chicago, that require the president to send in the National Guard and the like. And so the reality is that even though he became better prepared in that second term, he faced a whole other secondary set of circumstances beyond his, that he didn't have to deal with the first time around that ended up kind of tearing down his presidency. And I kind of see this past week, and it's like, there's definitely a lot more competency by many measures in terms of the way the Trump administration is going about things. But I just see a whole lot of sort of fires popping up that might be a lot more harder to sort of deal with using traditional political levers. And it kind of feels a little bit, a little Grover Cleveland-y this time around. But, well, we'll see how that continues to play out. And obviously will be a nice source of power and market content for the future. So, but before we get out of here, worth mentioning that along with our supporter summit coming up in October on Make America Free Again, October 16th through the 18th in beautiful Delray Beach. You can find more about that at Mises.org/events. We had a special event at the Institute this week with our Rothbard graduate seminar with summer fellows and graduate students from around. Connor, I know you've been hanging out with the fellows as our Auburn resident. Any kind of takeaways from the quality of students that we have going through the program this year?
Yeah, it's a good group this year. I have unfortunately not been able to sit in on any of the sessions, which is too bad because I've really enjoyed that in the past. There's like a lecture from one of the faculty members, and then they'll have like a 90-minute structured discussion, and they're great in there. And this year, especially, a lot of passion for this book. They're going through Man, Economy, and State, but they're also bringing in a lot of aspects of Murray Rothbard, the context behind Murray Rothbard writing Man, Economy, and State, which I think has been really good as these young scholars figure out their path to hear his struggles and sort of how he persisted through some institutional issues in academia and kind of stayed grounded in good economic theory despite all that is probably really good for these students to hear about.
Yeah, the RGS students getting a special sneak peek at the Salerno Patrick Newman 2026 book, the Making of a Misesian Economist, kind of an intellectual biography of Murray Rothbard, which was very interesting to get a little preview of that. Ryan, before we get out of here, any nostalgic tales from when you were a young Mises student lad with more hair? What was the highlight of your time at the Institute when you were a student?
Well, I never went to RGS. I just went to Mises University in 1998. Although I did go down to a couple of AERCs when I was a graduate student. But I just loved Mises U. I describe it like a summer camp for econ nerds, like later on, years later. I only went once. Some people go multiple years, but I got married a year after I went to Mises U, so I never went back. I had other stuff going on at that point. But yeah, if any undergrads are considering going to that, I couldn't possibly recommend it more, even if you're not that closely associated with Austrian economic stuff or you don't know that much about it. I mean, Mises U is a great place to start where you learn about it. I certainly wasn't well read or anything in Austrian economics when I went to Mises U. I was starting from pretty low state like everybody else. And I think it helped me a lot in graduate school later after that because I just had more of, more of an ideological rudder, more of a great filter to filter stuff through after that, books I was reading, papers I was reading, and that sort of thing. And I presented some papers over the years. So remember, I never worked for the Mises Institute or was involved directly until 2013. And so for all those years from 99 to 2013, I was just a casual observer. And when I had little kids, I never went very often, but it was always fun to go down, older AERC type stuff. And Mises U is always just a great place to start. And that's usually how the progression works. You start at Mises U, then if you get more involved and you're in grad school, you can go to Rothbard Graduate Seminar. If then you're even more involved, you can become a summer fellow, that sort of thing. But then even as a professional, you can still attend the academic conference, which is AERC. Then once you're old and wealthy, then those are probably two separate groups. There's the people who become professional academics, and then there's the people who get old and wealthy. Usually they don't intersect. But if you're one of the old and wealthy kinds, of course, by wealthy, I mean you have some money to spare, you go to our supporter summit in the fall. So there's something for everybody. But yeah, just as a 21-year-old back in the day, it was just an immense amount of fun. You just met so many people who were kind of like you or had common interests. So rarely have I been in a situation like that where kind of everything you said was kind of safe, so to speak, in mixed company, and that other people were kind of interested in it and maybe even on some level on agreement as well. Not total agreement because there was a lot of debate, but people were coming from, I think, a similar framework and life experience and things like that. Just similar enough that you had something to talk about, but different enough that you could learn a lot from each other, people from different countries, obviously people from different regions of the country and that sort of thing. So that was great. That was a long time ago now, but the event itself hasn't changed very much. When I witness it as a staff member now, seems pretty darn similar. So if I don't know what the deadlines are for this year, has it already come or gone? But if you've missed this year, definitely look at next year.
Yes, definitely look for next year. We'll be having Mises U next month in July. Beautiful summers in Auburn, so looking forward to that as well. And again, a reminder, if you want to hang out with people like Ryan and those wealthy folks he was describing, the Supporters Summit in October 16th through the 18th in beautiful Delray Beach. Jim Bovard will be the speaker, along with a great list, including Guido Holzman, Tom DeLorenzo, Joe Salerno, and quite a few others. So excited for that as well. Well, this has been our weekly roundup of the most topical events this week. Maybe a therapy session for some of you as well. Always a good time. For Ryan McMakin, for Connor O'Keefe, this is Tho Bishop. We'll see you next week. Proceed ever more boldly.